Monique Carter walked into the courthouse, feeling a sense of quiet determination as she approached the courtroom for her hearing on a minor speeding ticket she had gotten a few weeks ago. She had always tried to follow the rules, but sometimes things just happened. Life was busy. And in this case, it had been an honest mistake. She wasn't expecting any trouble, but the moment she entered the room, she could feel the tension in the air. The judge was already sitting at his bench, and the other people in the room were quiet. The judge looked up from his papers for a moment, his eyes scanning her as she stood before him. She didn't like the way he was looking at her, but she held her ground. She was here for a fair hearing. She had done nothing wrong. She would speak her case calmly and leave the courtroom without a problem. But from the start, Judge Richard Harrow wasn't interested in hearing her side. As soon as she began to explain her situation, he interrupted with a dismissive wave of his hand. He looked down at her with a stern gaze, as if she were wasting his time. Monique tried to stay composed, but she could feel her frustration bubbling up inside her. It wasn't just about the ticket anymore. It was about how he was treating her. She could sense the subtle but unmistakable disdain in his tone, and the way his eyes lingered on her, as if she were somehow less deserving of respect than anyone else in the room. When she mentioned her clean driving record and how this was an isolated incident, the judge scoffed under his breath, dismissing her words as though they didn't matter. She was just another black woman in his court, and he had already made up his mind. Before hearing her out, Monique knew exactly what was happening, and she couldn't believe it. Not again. She had faced prejudice before, but this was different. He was a judge. He held power in this courtroom. He was supposed to be impartial. She had never felt so small, so invisible in her life. She was about to speak up when the judge raised his voice and issued a fine. She was stunned for a moment, but then she heard the numbers being spoken, and it was clear he wasn't even going to bother explaining his reasoning. It was as if he had already decided she would pay the price for something that wasn't her fault. Her chest tightened with anger, but she stayed silent. She wasn't going to let him see how much this hurt, how much his behavior made her feel less than human. Instead, she turned and walked away as quickly as possible, the weight of the fine hanging over her head, but also the weight of the injustice that she had just experienced. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the ticket. It was about the blatant disregard for her as a person. And that hurt more than anything. As she left the courthouse, Monique felt a cold resolve settle within her. She would not let this slide. She wouldn't let this man define how her day or her life would go. She would not be dismissed or silenced. Not this time, not ever again. And as she left the building, she made a vow to herself to fight back, no matter what it took, no matter who stood in her way. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Monique sat in her car as she drove away from the courthouse. The city's streets were bustling with life, but inside she felt a growing emptiness. She had just been humiliated in front of a room full of people by a man who wore a robe that symbolized authority and justice, yet she knew that he had done neither. He had treated her with such disregard simply because of the color of her skin, and she couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that clung to her. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about how she had been dehumanized, how her voice had been drowned out by his harsh words and dismissive attitude. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She had faced racism before, but this time it was different. It wasn't just some random person on the street or a colleague who made a careless comment. This was a man who held power in his hands. He was supposed to be someone who protected the rights of all people, yet here he was making her feel small, as though she didn't deserve the same respect as anyone else in that courtroom. The thought made her stomach churn. As she sat at a red light, she clenched her fists on the steering wheel. She couldn't let this go. She refused to let it slide. She wouldn't be the next person who accepted the injustice and let it sink into her bones. She knew what she had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. She had always been someone who prided herself on staying calm and composed in the face of adversity, but this time something had snapped inside her. There was a fire burning deep within her, and it wasn't just about the fine. It was about standing up for herself and others who had been treated like this. For far too long, Monique decided she would start by researching Judge Harrow. She wasn't just going to let this be an isolated incident. She needed to know who he was, what kind of judge he had been, and what his track record looked like in the courtroom. If he had treated her this way, there was a good chance that he had done the same to others. She needed to find out if there were any patterns of bias or discrimination in his rulings. She spent the next few hours combing through online records, court transcripts, and news articles. She read about his history, with cases involving people of color, and each story she uncovered filled her with a mix of disbelief and anger. It was clear that Judge Harrow had a reputation for being unfair when it came to black defendants. His rulings were harsh, his comments often demeaning, and his overall conduct was far from impartial. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Monique's heart raced with a new sense of purpose. She had to do something about this. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had walked into that courtroom and been treated like they didn't matter, every person who had been wronged by someone who should have been their protector. As the night wore on, Monique could barely tear herself away from the screen. She was focused on one thing now: bringing justice to the people who had suffered under the same bias that had just been used against her. She was going to file a formal complaint and make sure that Judge Harrow's actions were exposed, no matter the cost. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. It would be a battle, but she was ready to fight. She couldn't let this man continue to wield his power without accountability, not when she knew the truth. And as she closed her laptop for the night, she felt something shift inside her. This was no longer just about a speeding ticket. It was about creating change, and she wasn't backing down. Monique woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose that had been missing for a long time. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The anger from the previous day had not faded, but instead, it had transformed into something stronger. A deep, burning need to take action. She wasn't going to be just another person who let this go. She was going to do something about it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by people like Judge Harrow. The first step was clear. She needed to file a formal complaint. She spent the next few hours gathering all the evidence she had found about Harrow's past cases. His history with biased rulings was undeniable, and she was determined to make sure that the people responsible for overseeing judicial conduct knew the truth. Monique carefully organized every piece of information: court rulings, news articles, testimonies, and even her own experience, and then wrote a detailed account of Judge Harrow's behavior. She knew that her complaint had to be thorough, factual, and unassailable. Once it was ready, she took a deep breath and submitted it to the Judicial Review Board. As she clicked send, a wave of nervous energy washed over her. This was a big step, and there was no turning back now. But despite the fear, she felt a surge of hope as well. This could make a difference. It had to. In the following days, Monique went about her usual work, but the complaint was never far from her mind. She stayed up late at night, checking her inbox for any updates, but there was nothing. Each day felt longer than the last as she waited, hoping for some response, some sign that her efforts were being taken seriously. But weeks went by, and still there was silence. Just when Monique was beginning to feel like she might be fighting an uphill battle, an unexpected email arrived in her inbox. It was from the Office of the Judicial Oversight Committee. Her complaint had been received, and after an initial review, they were moving forward with an investigation. Monique's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped for this, but it was hard to believe that it was finally happening. She was about to face an uphill battle. This was just the beginning, but it was a step forward, and that was all she needed to keep going. The investigation was slow at first, but Monique stayed persistent, checking in regularly and even offering to provide additional evidence. The more the committee dug into Judge Harrow's past, the more they uncovered. He had been reprimanded before for similar behavior, but nothing had ever been done to hold him fully accountable. The system had turned a blind eye, allowing him to continue in his position of power despite his history of bias. Monique could feel her blood boiling as she read through the details of Harrow's past rulings, each one more egregious than the last. She knew she had to stay focused. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. Every piece of evidence she had gathered, every email she had sent, was leading them closer to the truth. She wasn't going to let him get away with it, not this time. And as the investigation moved forward, Monique felt a growing sense of empowerment. She wasn't just another person lost in the system. She was part of a movement that was fighting for change, and she was going to make sure her voice was heard. The days stretched on, but Monique knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down. She had started something, and she wasn't going to stop until Judge Harrow faced the consequences of his actions. The days blurred together as Monique moved through her routine, but her focus never wavered. The investigation into Judge Harrow continued, and though it felt like progress was slow, Monique could feel the momentum building. She received periodic updates from the Judicial Oversight Committee, each one more encouraging than the last. They had reviewed numerous cases and found a troubling pattern of bias in Harrow's rulings. They were now preparing to conduct interviews with other people who had been affected by his decisions. Monique was encouraged by the thought that it wasn't just her complaint that was driving this forward. It was the collective voices of everyone who had suffered under his biased judgment. One afternoon, while working at her desk, Monique received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, introducing herself as a representative from a prominent legal organization focused on promoting diversity and fairness in the justice system. The organization had heard about Monique's efforts regarding Judge Harrow and wanted to meet with her. Monique's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected her fight to attract such attention, but she quickly agreed to the meeting. The meeting was set for the following week, and Monique arrived early, eager to see what it was about. She walked into the sleek conference room and was greeted by a group of lawyers who had done extensive work in the area of judicial reform. The leader of the group, a woman named Carla, smiled warmly as she extended her hand. "We've been following your work," Carla began. "What you're doing is remarkable. We believe in your mission, and we want to offer our support." Monique felt a surge of relief. She had known that what she was doing wasn't easy, but now to have the backing of an organization with influence and resources felt like a major turning point. The organization had access to legal tools and public platforms that could elevate her cause to a much larger audience. They discussed strategies for pushing forward with the investigation and how they could use media coverage to shine a spotlight on the broader issue of judicial bias. By the time Monique left the meeting, she felt empowered in a way she hadn't before. She had always been driven, but now it felt like she had an army behind her. As she made her way back to her office, she couldn't help but think about how much her life had changed in such a short time. She was no longer just a lawyer working in a world of legal paperwork and cases. She was becoming a voice for justice, a force for change. But the real surprise came the next day. As Monique arrived at her office, her assistant handed her a thick envelope with an official seal. She opened it quickly, her hands trembling as she read the letter inside. The Judicial Oversight Committee had completed their initial investigation into Judge Harrow's conduct. The evidence was clear. His decisions were steeped in bias, and he had been warned multiple times in the past about his conduct. But this time, the stakes were higher. The committee was preparing to take formal action. Monique's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the moment she had worked so hard for. The letter outlined the next steps. Harrow would be summoned for a formal hearing where he would have to answer for his actions. Monique's heart raced, knowing that her efforts were about to reach their peak. This wasn't just about holding one man accountable. It was about starting a conversation that could ripple across the entire judicial system. She sat down at her desk, staring at the letter in her hands. She had come so far, but she also knew the hardest part was still to come. The hearing would be her moment of truth. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all the people who had been ignored, silenced, and forgotten. And she wasn't going to stop now. Monique could hardly contain the flutter of excitement in her chest as she read the letter from the Judicial Oversight Committee. The investigation into Judge Harrow's conduct had moved forward faster than she anticipated, and now a formal hearing was scheduled. The thought of the upcoming hearing sent a wave of nervous energy through her, but it was a good kind of nervousness. This was the breakthrough she had been working toward. Her complaint, her determination, her relentless pursuit of justice had brought them to this moment. There was no turning back now. The days leading up to the hearing were a whirlwind. Monique spent hours preparing, poring over every detail of her complaint, every piece of evidence, and every argument she could make. She had a meeting with the legal organization that had reached out to her, and they walked her through the process. They offered guidance on how to present her case, how to stay composed, and how to handle the inevitable pressure. They were preparing her for the fight of her life. For the first time since this all began, Monique felt truly ready. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was focused. She had a purpose, and she wasn't going to let anything distract her. This wasn't just about exposing Judge Harrow's wrongdoings. This was about creating a ripple effect in the justice system. The way people of color were treated in courtrooms needed to change, and Monique was going to make sure that change started with her. The day of the hearing arrived, and Monique stood in front of the courthouse, looking up at the imposing building. It seemed so much larger now, as though the weight of her mission had made everything feel more significant. As she entered the building, she was met by the same cold, sterile environment that had once made her feel small and invisible. But now, it was different. She wasn't walking in as the defendant anymore. She was walking in as someone who had the power to make a difference. Inside the hearing room, Monique sat at a table facing the panel of judges and committee members who would decide Judge Harrow's fate. She was flanked by her legal allies, who had been guiding her through this process every step of the way. As she looked around the room, she couldn't help but notice the mix of emotions on the faces of the committee members. Some seemed disinterested, others looked uncomfortable, and a few appeared genuinely engaged. She had no idea what the outcome would be, but she knew she had to give it everything she had. Then Judge Harrow walked in. Monique's pulse quickened as she saw him. His demeanor was calm, but there was a tension in his shoulders that made it clear he knew what this was about. He was no longer the judge sitting on the bench, issuing verdicts without consequence. He was now just another person under scrutiny, and the tables had finally turned. He made eye contact with Monique briefly, but she didn't flinch. He was trying to read her, to intimidate her, but it didn't work. She was beyond that now. The hearing began with opening statements. Harrow's defense was predictable. He denied any wrongdoing, dismissing the evidence as misunderstandings and attacking the credibility of Monique's complaint. He tried to downplay the significance of his biased rulings, claiming that any mistakes were unintentional. But Monique was ready. She stood up and made her statement, calm and composed, but with a fire in her eyes. She laid out the facts, the evidence, and the undeniable truth of Harrow's actions. She spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly in his courtroom. As she spoke, she could feel the room shift. The once skeptical committee members were now paying attention, their eyes fixed on her. They were listening. This wasn't just a case about a single incident. It was about a system that allowed judges like Harrow to continue their harmful behavior unchecked. And Monique wasn't going to let that continue. When the hearing finally concluded, Monique felt a sense of quiet triumph. She had done everything she could. Now it was in the hands of the committee. They would make their decision, but Monique knew one thing for sure. She had given it her all, and there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, she had already won. The days that followed the hearing were some of the longest of Monique's life. Every moment felt like it stretched on forever as she waited for the committee's decision. She tried to focus on her work, to maintain some sense of normalcy, but it was difficult. The hearing had been a turning point, but now, everything was hanging in the balance. The outcome would change the course of her life, and possibly the lives of many others who had faced the same type of bias and mistreatment. Monique stayed in close contact with her legal team and the advocacy organization, but there was little they could do but wait. The committee was deliberating, and that could take days, even weeks. She tried to occupy herself with small tasks, keeping her mind off the uncertainty, but every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat. Was it an update? Was the decision coming? Finally, just over a week later, Monique received the call she had been waiting for. She picked up her phone and her heart raced as she heard Carla's voice on the other end. "Monique, I've got news," she said, her tone serious but hopeful. "The committee has reached a decision." Monique felt a lump form in her throat. "What did they decide?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Judge Harrow has been found guilty of judicial misconduct," Carla said. "The evidence was undeniable. He's being removed from the bench and will face further investigation regarding other complaints filed against him. This is a huge win, Monique. You did it." Monique's breath caught in her chest. She could hardly believe it. After months of fighting, of pushing forward despite every obstacle, she had succeeded. The weight of everything she had gone through, the late nights, the doubts, the challenges, finally felt worth it. Harrow's reign of bias and injustice had come to an end. But as the news settled in, Monique realized something. This victory was not just for her. It was for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. It was for all the people who had been dismissed, overlooked, and treated as less than. This was a moment of accountability, and it was a small but powerful step toward systemic change. But Monique knew this was just the beginning. There was still much work to be done. Over the next few weeks, news of Harrow's removal from the bench spread across the media. Stories about Monique's role in bringing attention to his misconduct began to surface, and soon she found herself in the spotlight. It was a strange feeling to have her name in the headlines, to be recognized not just as a lawyer, but as a symbol of courage and perseverance. While the attention felt overwhelming at times, Monique knew it was necessary. The more people who heard her story, the more who understood the real issue, that systemic bias in the justice system could no longer be ignored. Monique was approached by activists, journalists, and even community leaders who praised her for her bravery. But she didn't want to be seen as a hero. She wanted to be seen as a catalyst for change. She wasn't fighting for accolades or praise. She was fighting because she knew that this fight was bigger than herself. She was part of a movement, a push for justice that was long overdue. Still, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far she had come. The young woman who had once walked into that courtroom, unsure and afraid, had transformed into someone who could stand tall and face her adversary head-on. She had made a difference, and as Monique sat quietly one evening, reflecting on all that had happened, she realized that this moment wasn't just about changing one judge's career. It was about shifting the conversation around fairness, equity, and justice. The battle wasn't over, but this victory was a significant one. Monique had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let it be silenced. The victory over Judge Harrow had been monumental, but for Monique, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something even greater. She had spent years quietly working within the legal system, fighting for her clients and for justice, but this was different. She had shown the world what one person could do when they decided to take a stand. The victory had propelled her into the public eye, and with that attention came new opportunities. Activists, community leaders, and even political figures reached out to her, offering their support and encouragement. Monique, however, didn't want to be swept up in the accolades. She wasn't looking for praise. She had never sought the limelight. What she wanted was change, real, lasting change. The removal of Judge Harrow was an important moment, but it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The justice system, she knew, had many more flaws to address. She was determined to keep pushing for accountability and reform, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly in the courts. The media coverage of her case had sparked a conversation about judicial bias, and Monique knew she had a platform now, one that could be used to challenge the system in ways she had never imagined. She started speaking at community forums, legal conferences, and universities, sharing her story and calling for transparency and reform within the judiciary. She was no longer just a lawyer. She had become an advocate for a movement, a voice for those who had been wronged and unheard. In one such speech, Monique stood in front of a crowd at a law school, the room filled with eager students and professionals. She spoke passionately about the need for diversity in the legal field, not just in terms of race, but also in terms of experience and perspective. The justice system, she said, was never meant to be impartial if the people in charge don't reflect the diverse communities they serve. She called for more accountability, urging the students to be the ones who would change the system from the inside. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, and the questions that followed were thoughtful and probing. Some asked about her experience with the judicial review process, others about her thoughts on the current state of legal education. But one question in particular struck a chord. "What keeps you going?" a student asked. "How do you stay motivated in a system that feels so broken?" Monique paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the room. She had faced so much in her journey, from the dismissive judge to the long hours of research, and the slow, often disheartening pace of reform. But in that moment, she knew exactly what had kept her going. "I keep going," she said, "because I know that every fight, every step, every small victory counts. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, it's hard, but it's necessary. We cannot afford to stop fighting for a better future, for a better system. If we don't, who will?" Her words echoed in the room, leaving behind a sense of resolve. Monique knew she had ignited something in those students, something that could continue long after she had moved on to the next stage of her journey. Back in her own life, Monique's work continued to evolve. She partnered with several organizations advocating for judicial reform, and her involvement grew deeper. She began consulting with lawmakers on new policies aimed at improving the transparency of judicial appointments and the oversight of judicial behavior. She also worked on initiatives that provided legal support to those facing systemic discrimination in the courts, helping them navigate a system that had often treated them unjustly. But despite all the progress, Monique never lost sight of why she started this journey in the first place. She wasn't doing it for recognition or fame. She was doing it for the people whose voices had been ignored for far too long. She was doing it for the people who had suffered at the hands of biased systems like Judge Harrow's courtroom. Every day, Monique worked toward a future where fairness wasn't an exception, it was the rule. And with each step, she felt closer to making that vision a reality. As the months passed, Monique's efforts continued to gather momentum. Her work had become a full-time mission, and she had found a new purpose in leading the charge for reform. The attention surrounding her case and the removal of Judge Harrow had opened doors, but it was the long hours of advocacy, the conversations with lawmakers, and the quiet support from her community that fueled her progress. Each meeting, each speech, each conversation was another step toward a more just and equitable system. But Monique wasn't the only one who had changed. The people around her began to take notice. Some of her colleagues in the legal field who had once been skeptical of her ideas about judicial reform were now starting to see things differently. They too were beginning to question the fairness of the system they had long worked within. Slowly, more people in the legal community started to join her cause, and the movement grew stronger. It wasn't just Monique pushing for change anymore. It was a collective effort, one that was challenging the status quo and demanding accountability. One evening, Monique was invited to a gala held by a prominent civil rights organization. The event was a celebration of individuals who had made significant contributions to advancing justice and equality. Monique didn't consider herself to be one of them, but the invitation was a recognition of the impact she had made. As she entered the ballroom, her eyes scanned the room, seeing faces she recognized from various meetings, activists, lawyers, and advocates who shared her vision. As the evening unfolded, Monique was asked to speak. Standing at the podium, she felt a familiar sense of nerves, anxiety mixed with excitement. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was the awareness of the responsibility she carried, not just for herself, but for all those who had fought for this cause before her and all those who would come after. "I'm honored to be here tonight," Monique began, her voice steady and clear. "But I know this work is far from over. We've made progress, yes, but there's so much more to be done. The case against Judge Harrow was just one example of what we can accomplish when we stand together, but we can't stop there. We have to continue pushing, continue questioning, continue fighting for a justice system that truly serves everyone equally." The crowd listened intently, and Monique felt the weight of the moment. The applause that followed wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had stood by her side. For every person who had believed that change was possible. For every individual who had taken the time to raise their voice and make a difference. The applause was for the movement she had helped spark, one that was now larger than herself. Later that night, as Monique sat in the back of a car on her way home, she reflected on how much had changed. She had once been the quiet, overlooked lawyer in the courtroom, but now she was someone who had brought real change. Judge Harrow's removal had been the first victory, but it was the ripple effect that truly mattered. She was no longer just fighting one man's bias. She was challenging an entire system. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized the true power of the work she was doing. This wasn't about her career or her personal gain. It was about creating a legacy of fairness, equity, and justice for those who had been systematically oppressed for far too long. When Monique finally arrived home, she felt exhausted but fulfilled. She had come a long way since the day she first walked into that courtroom, the day she had made the decision to take a stand. And though she knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult, she also knew that she was no longer alone. She had ignited something much bigger than herself, and that, she believed, was how true change happened. The fight for justice would continue, but Monique had proven that one voice, one person, could make a difference. And that was just the beginning.